we are very happy that you agreed to give us the honor to serve as our keynote speaker, and we really look forward to your keynote address titled Vectors of Practicality, the Social Gospel, the YMCA, and the Evangelical Missionary Movement in the United States and Asia from about the 1890s to the 1930s.
Well, thank you very much, Stefan, and of course thanks to you, your Harold, and the entire team that got us put together this conference. Thank you for inviting me, and I was going to spend a little bit of time telling you why I thought they invited me, but you've already heard that. What I was really going to say was that I had no intention of self-advertising with this book cover, but it just occurred to me that what I was doing in the paper was actually taking a couple of lines of that book and questioning them, going back to first principles and working out in detail what that meant. So I guess I've got that book to blame as well as to thank for being here, because I've had to go back and to ask, was my explanation correct? If it was not, how can we modify it? Okay? As you will see as I go. I begin with historiography and the methodological context. The colonial-centred way of seeing Asian history in the age of European empires through the lens of imperial initiatives and Asian responses gave way to the idea of local agency in the 1960s to 1980s. Western missionaries were marginalised as a subject in favour of subaltern studies. However, since the 1990s, the collapse of the categories of East and West, aligned and non-aligned, and other geopolitical dualisms has both accompanied and stimulated the beginnings of a new transnational and transcultural history. Distinctive characteristics are the recognition that the exchange between East and West, metropole and colony and so on should be seen as reciprocal and parts of regional and global networks. Yet Western historians such as myself, for reasons of language, available resources and topical and regional specialisations, often still engage in metropole-centred histories of these encounters between Asia and the West, or at best, the interaction of metropole and colony. A more collective effort is required to fulfil the promise of transnational history. But there is a need to recognise different levels of analysis. Most important are the multilateral nature of contexts and the transnational spaces in the interstices of colonial empires and across empires. These are new and important fields of endeavour. While work needs to be done on all missionary groups, American Protestants, whose work was facilitated by and aided patterns of late 19th century globalisation, were active in transnational organising into the 1920s, a time of enhanced nationalism and interwar internationalism. By their work, they made a major contribution to the emergence of that internationalism. Christian organisations such as the Student Volunteer Movement, the YMCA and YWCA, crossed national and imperial boundaries. That's just the names of some of the major organisations that I will be discussing, just in case you don't know them. These cross national and imperial boundaries, but their collective history remains to be written. Here I seek to outline the pattern for the Anglo-American world, giving due weight to the local and indigenous as innovative in mediating the effects of colonialism and Western cultural penetration, but also the global effects of those encounters through transnational organising. I treat transnational as a shorthand term for work across national boundaries, colonies and empires, and international for the formal contacts between nations or their representatives. Although inevitably there is overlap between these two seemingly separate concepts. Asian intercultural contexts within the social gospel movement are central to this conference. This raises questions whether Asia is merely a figment of the Western imagination. The groups I am discussing did not simply lump everybody together as Asian, but saw certain parts of the landmass of Asia as key leverage for a, quote, conquest of Asia. Here they articulated a geopolitics of Protestant Christianity before an internationalism arose out of that endeavour. This metamorphosis came as a result of local infusions and experience. For Americans, China loomed large as a potential market for goods and souls. But in the 1880s, India and Japan were equally or more important, especially in India, because of the shared language of English among the elites and the growing Indian education and syncretic religious movements. The field was thought ripe for conversion among the young, yet a danger at the same time. There was widespread acceptance that any Christian conversion must accept some indigenization due to the sheer numbers to be persuaded in Asia. And this theme came to the fore after 1900 as nationalist movements grew in strength. Asia did function in the minds of missionary strategists as a space for transnational synergies, with ideas, techniques and projects sweeping across colonial boundaries. For Americans, networks of communications were vital in taking advantage of opportunities for cultural change. This topic therefore adds to our understanding of transnational history and its global networks. The question of Asia and the social gospel should be seen in this light. Much of this work did come under the rubric of the social gospel, but the concept itself has had a mixed history. Interest in it among historians peaked from the 1930s to 60s, when the American state was expanding to include social welfare and when the Protestant mainline churches were still key in American life. The social gospel became closely identified with the YMCA, a connection treated in the pioneering work of Hopkins and White. It was also linked with those Protestant churches that became the 20th century broadly liberal in sympathies. These were also the groups that led the North American and to some extent British Protestant missionary outpourings of the 1880s onwards, which became in turn identified in the US case with American cultural expansion and even at times with imperialism. But in historiography, the decline in formal mainline Protestant identification, leakage to the faith-based churches and the secularization of liberal academics in the 1960s has produced in the US a neglect of both religious and missionary history until recently. Some neglect of the social gospel idea has been collateral damage in that process. It does not help to rectify the neglect that the social gospel was a concept with unclear boundaries. That Charles Sheldon, Josiah Strong, Washington Gladden and Walter Rauschenbusch could all be contained within its label was one issue. At one end of the spectrum, Sheldon's work focused on what an Australian contemporary reviewer called, quote, a greater degree of earnestness in individual lives, attacking gambling, drinking and other moral issues. At the other end, Rauschenbusch imported a coherent social content to his theology. The use in other countries, particularly Britain, of the term social Christianity was another possible confusion, suggesting differences in approach regarding institutions and ideology. The social gospel should therefore be treated as a process with a continuum of ideas concerning the correct relationship between the kingdom of God and earthly attainments, in which social action is the practical realization of Christian service. The treatment of the social gospel in an idealist fashion as a sort of spirit of the age wafting over social movements is unconvincing. What exactly were its roots, its social causation and trajectory? Noticeable has been the neglect in this history of the important part played by women, until recent interventions by Fishburne, Gifford and others, and the concentration in most studies on an elite of white male reformers and evangelical intellectuals. This absence was partly addressed in Ralph Luca's older work, The Social Gospel in Black and White, Gary Dorian's Black Social Gospel, and Heath Carter's Union Made. I thought I had a transparency about that. Is that the previous one? There you go. That's some of the names that I'm talking about here. Except for the last, the emphasis upon ideas rather than practice limits the capacity of the social gospel concept to make sense of American social and cultural history and its making of race and gender fundamental in historical accounts. Moreover, the social gospel as social practice has links with missionaries that remain understudied. Only for domestic missions has the social gospel service connection been treated, especially by Ralph Luca, the missionary continuities of later post-1945 US government modernization programs in the Third World have also been noted in the work of David Ekblad, The Great American Mission, and in David Immerwahr's recent work, Thinking Small. The term modernization, its relationship with development, is also contested. American work under the social gospel in Asia involved not simply Christianizing, but in practice modernizing the culture of target audiences, putting the stress upon individual cultural change rather than the social structure. Yet there were counter-currents, and missionaries and their auxiliary organisations engaged frequently in cultural adaptation, with indigenization providing the main conduit for that process. The development that missionaries sought in the early to mid-20th century does not seem to have been simple modernization, always. Recent work on economic development and US foreign policy post-1945, as I've intimated, does recognise the importance of missionaries as providing some background or even continuity with what went on post-World War II. But in the critique of developmentalism in these works and elsewhere, one should not read back subsequent patterns into the early to mid-20th century, where small-scale action was considered key, often in NGO programs operating alongside colonial government reforms, as Immerwahr suggests for the US. Most work deals with the outward expansion of American power and the projection of American ideas of social gospel. It is influenced by the reception of Josiah Strong's Our Country of 1885, and the vision that makes the social gospel part of the American imperial project at the turn of the 20th century. In many textbooks, it is strangely not considered a problem that Strong's work predated the Spanish-American War by 13 years, and that Strong did not consider overseas colonies in 1885, but rather anticipated a demographic race of survival under Darwinian theory. Not until expansion under New World conditions, 1900, did Strong sanction territorial aggrandizement abroad, and he did not make missionary work there central to the process. In clarifying social gospel's career abroad, identification with Strong is therefore dubious. The 1890s to the 1920s marked the high point of mainline Protestant Christian missionary effort through widespread impacts upon American society, through furloughs, returnees, and the activities of boards organising the missionary enterprise. Asia lay at the heart of this Protestant ambition to create a more Christian world, to realise the social gospel ideal of the, quote, kingdom of God, unquote, on earth through, quote, social service as a social practice, one of Rauschenbusch's ideas. India, China and Japan were chief targets because these regions were undergoing the most intense economic disruption under the impact of Western cultural and economic penetration. They were the biggest fields, but Southeast Asia, the Strait Settlements and the Kingdom of Siam figured in missionary calculations too. Some of these colonial or quasi-colonial settings presented, through nationalist movements, alternatives to imperialism in ways that Africa did not at that time. This missionary work opened spaces for social and economic innovation, particularly in the sector of agriculture, where Americans and their allies in China and India started social service programs to promote agrarian development. Mobilising the rural population for Christianity through agrarian reform began before World War I. By 1900, medical missionary work and the building of hospitals and schools was common in American missions, and in some cases went back decades before. But dealing with the social problems that colonial development presented was not central to the work of the evangelising forces from the United States through the student volunteer movement of 1886 and the YMCA of North America, which sent out officials from 1889. This was not the initial area of YMCA concern when arriving in India and China. A social gospel theologian, Rauschenbusch, wrote in 1912, I quote, the Young Men's Christian Association used to stand for religious individualism. The mere mention of sociology once excited ridicule, unquote. That organisation aggressively pushed religious conversion and targeted students to develop an educated cadre of leaders able to self-Christianise the Asian continent. But famine relief became famine relief became a pressing issue from the late 1890s. Earlier, famine had not been central to the global Protestant missionary work, but the spread of communications made the famines of that decade more visible to the donor countries and their emissaries. Sherwood Eddy, who will come up in a minute, I hope, Sherwood Eddy is closely associated with the social gospel, but he came to India in 1896 as an evangelist concerned at first with saving souls, not bodies. He remained to 1911, and this photo is taken from his book on the awakening of India of that year, where he's racing around his mission on a motorbike. Experience shifted his focus. By 1903, famine was a major interest, but not until 1915-16 did Eddy become associated with rural reform of a socio-economic kind, aimed in part at dealing with famine. This took two forms. One was cooperative banks engaged in microfinancing, the other agricultural institutes within mission schools, Christian universities and colleges. This is a pattern repeated with different temporal rhythms for different missionary groups, but a common feature is the role of local missionary effort in discovering the need for practical assistance through experience. For example, Sam Hickenbotham arrived in India with a BA from Princeton in 1903 as an earnest, gospel-oriented evangelical teacher, but quickly found that he needed an agricultural degree to make any headway. Higginbotham went back to the United States to study for this purpose and returned to start what became an agricultural college in 1910 at Allahabad. All over India and in China, changes in outlook of this kind were occurring. Randall Strauss shows a similar process in agricultural education, beginning around 1908 to 12 in China in his pioneering book, The Stubborn Earth. A major stimulus in India seems to have been the famine of 1897 to 1900, and communication to home boards on the growing Indian population and the inability of Indian agriculture to deal with these demographic problems. Realising that handouts and other palliative measures were not enough during the 1900 famine in Maharashtra, the American Board of Commissioners, the ABCFM as it's called, began an initiative of local missionaries at Ahmedabad in 1902 to devise agricultural education programs for mission stations to create, quote, industries as will be of commercial value and at the same time making the destitute children of the mission independent. So doing away with famine once and for all. Though the social gospel had diverse roots in the farms and cities of Asia as well as the United States and Europe, as I pointed out in my book, the YMCA Christian missionaries were not, strictly speaking, uniquely innovative through social service in these missionary fields. Rather, they responded to local conditions, to the local population, and to the changing political situation. They were chiefly significant as vectors for carrying new ideas to other places and internationalising social gospel work and social services such as agrarian reform. The shift was grounded in practical experience of missionaries evangelising in India and China, the initial result being few converts. With improved knowledge of famine conditions, due to improved communication, both local missions and YMCA leaders became increasingly aware that any hope of converting these people required addressing their material circumstances. Though I concentrate on India, famine also occurred in Shanxi province in China at much the same time, and there and across India, the American Christian Herald newspaper, a key missionary fundraiser, mobilised famine relief and drew the home church's attention to the problem. And there, that kind of graphic imagery, as you would probably know, was what was used to try to raise the alarm and to get funding. The funeral pyre of 1900 from the famine. More seemly images were those of Christians, but which by the state of the people photographed also should show that they were in danger of dying. There were other contexts than famine, of course. One was the interaction of material need with rising nationalism. Although especially obvious in India, this nationalism was a transnational phenomenon, and YMCA strategists saw their role as taking advantage of it for cross-fertilising of Christian movements in the Asian world. This synergy was precisely what the YMCA could promote with its international organising. Eddy put it plainly in his The New Era in Asia in 1913, where he tied economic modernisation and improved communications to the nationalist awakening. Japan's significance as a military power and empire was widely discussed among missionaries as well as geopolitical strategists. For nationalism, however, it was the increasing prominence of the Indian National Congress that stimulated wide awareness across the region. If the missionaries were to take advantage of the situation, they must become attentive to the rural masses, but channel energies into Christian service. Mobilising the rural poor was important. The massive convicts were, especially in South India, where the Protestant missions had made inroads in the 1890s, centred on the lower castes of landless and tenant farmers. And Eddie, I've got too strong a hit on that. Eddie was very, very concerned about this map and the areas of intense mass mobilisation. Most of what I'm talking about is occurring down here at Travancore, Timney Valley and the Tegaloo area up here, but he was looking at areas of mass conversion. He wanted to consider this as a theme, and how should the churches deal with the fact that people were converting, but they were converting perhaps for the wrong reasons, because of famine and being driven off their land. A further point is the different emphasis that the missions and indigenous Christians began to put upon the former's chosen answer to famine: agricultural expertise. Indians did not reject this approach, but it was they who pushed the missions and the British government to see the problem of famine in ways that made the social and political context central, rather than palliative relief of individual improvidence or critique of Indian cultural insufficiency. Missionary boards, on the other hand, condemned traditions such as the sacredness of cows and saw Western intervention as a modernising force. When in 1902 the ABCFM sent their first missionaries specifically to educate Indian farmers on modern agricultural practice in the wake of the famine, the stress was on the moral failures of Indians. The reports back home did not identify the key problem as the role of the British in shifting agriculture of India to cash crops exported by railroads and supported by irrigation. Missionary support for modernisation and pragmatic support for colonial rule was deeply ingrained in the American missionary approaches, and found expression in the report the missionary teacher Benjamin Honeycutt, a pioneer in the field of agricultural education, made on a comparative global basis in 1929. Honeycutt extolled the British contribution to India's modernisation through railroads and other engineering. The alternative, more Indian-centred explanation regarding the complexities of the caste structure and communalism and profound inequality in Indian society was made manifest by agitation from below. While not rejecting technology, Indian converts emphasised working within Indian traditions and practicalities concerning knowledge transfer. Rather than stress the role of experts, they focused in the 1910s on the delivery of social services and made the socio-economic problem of unequal access to economic and other resources key. Exposure to famine in India and growing awareness of the social and racial problems that underlay it did not shake Eddie's conviction, however, of the need for personal change as the root of social change. Personal conversion would produce cultural change and create social equality over time. Eddie toured India in 1915 and spoke mainly on the theme of the essential Christward nature of change. To the extent he mentioned material life, he emphasised the take-up among Indians of Western influences, individualism versus family structure or caste, rather than internal innovation. In this respect, Eddie's role in agrarian initiatives was reactive. This was partly because of his continuing commitment to the primacy of the gospel spread, but perhaps also because after 1911, designated as travelling secretary for Asia, he was never in one place long enough to engage in the research and development of a rural program that would be required. And so many, many photos from that era show Eddie touring around, and particularly his growing interest in China as a source of YMCA missionary endeavour. And there he is, photographed in Nanking, in the middle of that, with a group of European and local luminaries. The change was not primarily the doing of Eddie or the home boards. Rather, the Christian churches in South India led this rural work through microfinancing, the establishment of agricultural extension services and village cooperatives, albeit assisted by YMCA officials from the US, Canada and Britain, based in India. The work was underway in the YMCA's rural department in 1913. The leaders of the rural program included key Indigenous Christians. They advocated credit banks and arranged, quote, for the instruction and demonstration in practical agriculture, unquote. Daniel Samados trained as a lawyer but worked from 1914 for the YMCA's rural department. He later became a travelling lecturer and fundraiser, better known as K.T. Paul. I'm not going to try and pronounce his full Indian name. I hope you'll accept my apology. Normally known by Eddie as K.T. Better known as K.T. Paul, who headed the rural work from 1913 and was from 1916 National Secretary of the Indian YMCA. As the first Indigenous leader, he pushed for a formally constituted rural reconstruction program after 1918. Colleagues averred that he, quote, did the heavy part of the administrative work. He has enlisted the present secretaries, the cooperation of the leading men in the district, and secured the necessary funds, unquote. The groundwork was laid through plans for strategic centres providing agricultural and educational extension services for village associations established from 1914 onwards. These built upon the cooperative credit arrangements put in train by the British government in 1904. In fact, there were already 12,000 cooperatives and only one of them was based upon a mission station, showing that the North American YMCA was reactive to changes in Indian society and imperial British policy. Indigenous officials served as go-betweens on agricultural methods, marketing, etc. with the rural cooperatives. These associations were the means whereby the principles of the program of rural economics was spread and made available to large numbers of people. The YMCA considered their cadre as giving the work, quote, a distinct advantage over similar enterprises of the government that suffer from inadequate publicity, unquote. Building on this grassroots basis before entry to World War I, US entry to World War I, the Indian YMCA established in the early 1920s under Paul's initiative a Rural Reconstruction Centre led by Dr. Dwayne Spencer Hatch, which I think Harold is going to talk about, and I'm not going to trespass on his territory at all here, any more than that. Rural reconstruction genealogy was multilateral and transnational, however. K.T. Paul did not invent the term, though he so claimed. It came from YMCA humanitarian aid efforts in Europe at the end of World War I. We heard something about that, a little about that this morning, which officials such as Eddie had witnessed. Kenyon Butterfield, Massachusetts Agricultural College expert who became the chief spokesman for the internationalisation of the Indian and other mission initiatives in agricultural development in the 1920s, started to think about an explicit program of, quote, rural reconstruction, unquote, as a result of his war service for the YMCA, manifested in a 1919 book, The Farmer and the New Day. He already had missionary contacts from pre-World War I summer institutes on agriculture that the US YMCA held and which US YMCA officials from India had attended, but his initial interest expanded in the 1920s. As part of the China Educational Commission, a missionary body with both UK and US membership, Butterfield gathered material for his 1922 book on education and Chinese agriculture and stressed social and economic reconstruction grounded in village units. This was the Indian YMCA strategy from before the war. The cooperationist ideal also had other international sources. The Danish cooperative movement was the gold standard of such farming, and the Indians admired the Danes' work. Also influential was the Irishman Harold Plunkett. Plunkett's dreams of a multifaceted program of rural regeneration appealed to social gospelers in the United States, especially through the impact of Theodore Roosevelt's Country Life Commission in 1908-09, which Plunkett inspired. The YMCA, and which Butterfield was a member of, by the way, the YMCA in the US took up with alacrity after 1910 this country life work in the aid of what they called rural manhood, and they named their magazine after it. arguing that, or a magazine after they published, arguing that the farmer and his sons had been forgotten in the social gospel's drive to reform and aid city youth. A key link between the US government agricultural policy and the YMCA was Roosevelt's right-hand man, Gifford Pinchot, a rich Episcopalian who embraced the social gospel as part of his influential conservation reform at home. Pinchot wrote in the YMCA's Rural Manhood about the need for modern farmers, meaning both technical and scientific as well as cultural shifts, with educational opportunities and recreational ones too. He also encouraged activity through the layman's missionary movement of Christian businessmen. The Indian YMCA and its indigenous converts absorbed much from this swirl of metropolitan thinking through the YMCA channels, but they combined it with colonial restiveness evident in the campaigns of the Indian National Congress. K.T. Paul was a broad-ranging and strategic thinker. With Gandhian sympathies at first, he argued that Christians must be part of the nationalist movement, but could not, for demographic reasons, be leaders. This necessarily limited his role within the larger national struggle. Rather than dominate, the Christian student's role would be to negotiate between the deeply divided communal interests, he believed. For this, Paul championed education as an Indian responsibility under the new reforms of the British government after 1918, and argued that the future lay not with a small elite, but mass social transformation. Though Paul won the praise of England's Spectator for his later embrace of cooperation in the devolution of the British Raj, this was an advocacy which brought him into conflict with Gandhi and the non-cooperationist movement in the 1920s before Paul's untimely death in 1931. For this reason, his work became marginalised and later largely forgotten, but its impact on the YMCA and its international program was considerable. Eddie responded to such figures, while continuing to give priority to evangelism in his speeches back home. In India, he toured the villages and championed the cooperative banks that indigenous Christians were anxious to start. He gave money for the founding of, in 1916, of Madras Christian Cooperative Bank. He reported on its work to the American YMCA in articles published in 1916 and 1919 in their magazine Rural Manhood. This banking enterprise was endorsed by the YMCA international leadership. As Eddie showed, the origins of the idea lay in the indigenisation of the Indian YMCA. This work was mostly by males, though not only for males. The gendered and nationalist nature of the YMCA was apparent in Paul's stress upon the, quote, full, completed manhood, unquote, required for Indian regeneration. Applying the YMCA's triangular symbol and slogan of mind, body and spirit, Paul worked to see the youths of India, quote, ever fit and efficient for Christ-like service to others, unquote. But the gendered program of the Indian YMCA also exploited local traditions. Raised in a Telugu village by a single mother, Swamidas spoke directly of women's role. He represented women in his speeches as heroic, sacrificial figures using traditional cultural tropes. When he told the tale of his own mother, she stood for all India and appealed to such stereotypes won praise among foreign supporters. At a meeting in Adelaide, Australia in 1927, Swamidas left, quote, scarcely a dry eye in the church as he told the story of this heroic Indian mother, unquote, and her sacrifice to ensure that he could serve India. That is why, he concluded, they call me Swamidas, which means God's servant, unquote. But gender and racial stereotypes aside, one must remember that the rural work was aimed at families. Swamidas, quote, gathered around him at Nellore, just north of Madras district, the most promising of the young men and their wives within a 10-mile radius, and taught them in a model village how to read and write, giving, quote, practical medical instruction and tuition in different vocations, unquote. This included spinning and weaving for the women. So you can see Nellore is around about there. The Young Women's Christian Association mostly complemented this male-dominated presence. The world's YWCA came to India in 1895, but its rural initiatives seem to have developed from the YMCA models. In the 1920s, the YMCA in India followed the male scheme of a decade before in creating rural departments and introduced spinning and weaving classes. This was a strategy that, like the rural reconstruction movement, under YMCA leadership, tried to synchronise with the awakening of the Indian masses. The input of indigenous Christian converts such as Columbia University educated Maya Das was important in that process, but the YWCA's work has been interpreted as the export of the social gospel idea applied to Indian circumstances, rather than a multilateral set of exchanges. One has to turn instead to Lauren Anderson's current work on Juliet Derricott or Renate Howe's The Australian Christian Movement and Women's Activism in the Asia-Pacific region to get a full sense of the tensions between missionary expansion, gender and racial aspirations and internationalism, a conflict that played out in the meetings of the international missionary organisations. That, though the North American YMCA was not the source of the innovation, it was a suitable vehicle for these local educated Christians to further their aspirations. Paul and others took up the support of American Y and student volunteer mentors such as John Mott, you've already seen his face today, who toured India with Paul before World War I for financial assistance and advice. They seized upon the opportunity of the missionary phalanx offered for the indigenisation of the student cadre. Paul stated that the YMCA was better suited for this work than the missions themselves because there was, quote, no preference by reason of caste, colour and creed, of wealth, poverty, of urban and rural status, unquote. An Indian judge said that, quote, the Indian church in Travancore can never be strong until it is led by Indian leaders. To my mind, the Young Men's Christian Association is much better fitted than the mission for raising up and training that leadership, unquote. Why so? Because it was non-denominational, indeed not targeted at church institutions, and committed to indigenisation from 1930. Its focus on youth and education brought it credibility as innovative. Its, quote, most outstanding thing, Paul boasted, was, quote, the wonderful adaptability of the movement to a new situation, unquote. Though the YMCA also had the reputation for superior sources of funding derived from its philanthropic context in the US, even more important was the capacity of its interdenominational work to transmit knowledge about agrarian reform between different denominational missions and to other transnational organisations. These characteristics made the North American YMCA a crucial vector for the young Indian YMCA officials who took positions in the organisation from 1913 to 1924. And there's a map of the so-called international reach of the YMCA in 1921-22. But the YMCA indebtedness to the indigenous movements went beyond the Christian cadre that joined its own ranks. It extended to larger social environments. The mobilisation began not only among Protestant Indians, but also Catholic Indians, such as Louis Dominique Swamikangu Palau. It was he who started the first cooperative bank in Madras Presidency in 1904. Palau was a register of the Cooperative Credit Societies in Madras and a pillar of the Catholic Church. He served as president for a while of the Madras Legislative Council. At a time when the ABC-FM still exhibited bigoted attitudes towards the Catholic missions in India as depraved and idolatrous competitors, Paul did not limit his work to cooperation with evangelical Protestants. Paul and Swamidas's work did not come in a social and political vacuum. Rather, it reflected wider agricultural reform signalled in the British Raj's passage of the Cooperative Societies Act of 1904, modified in 1912. Paul wanted to further the cooperative movement and realised that the district cooperative banks that the government created under British law would not loan to the local communal groups or societies without adequate security. Poor farmers could not satisfy this criteria. Caste disability deprived many peasants, including Christians, of membership in government cooperative credit societies, and hence access to cheap loans. That is why Paul turned to the YMCA and Eddie's own personal wealth. While the cooperatives that Paul organised were not exclusively for Christians, the presence of, quote, rural Christian communities, unquote, across southern India with a sufficiently large number of adherents was key. These village communities supplied a disciplined corps of officials and agents to educate lower castes in the new methods of credit. They were trained, quote, by government experts in the bookkeeping of cooperative loan societies, the auditing of books, and general business principles, unquote. The strategy was still influenced by evangelical Protestantism's North American moral agenda, inculcated through the literature of Christian Endeavour, an organisation which requires more study, by the way, in the WCTU, widely circulated in the Christian missions. This process imparted at first glance paternalistic elements to rural reform. Alcohol consumption among loan applicants was frowned upon, for example. The cooperatives were also used to reallocate outlays on dowries and traditional wedding feasts. YMCA officials believed that Indigenous committees in the village cooperatives, not distant officials, could best persuade Indian peasants to divert their money from such non-productive expenditure. It was not a strategy imposed from above. It was Swamidass who pushed the anti-alcohol policy, using traditional Indian concerns about what he called the 5 devils of India: dirt, debt, drunkenness, demons and disease, unquote. In turn, this transnational work spurred reciprocal flows to the US. The work had impacts on the entire structure and strategy of mission activity in the US by the 1930s, underlining and reinforcing ecumenicism and an internationalist ideology. The nature of the social gospel ideology, especially its emphasis on practical application and participation, facilitated these transfers of knowledge and helped to push the ideology into areas of more secular reform. This indigenous movement had implications in the United States via the YMCA's own global network that you can see there. The YMCA served this purpose when officials returned home to work in the churches and in the committees and bureaucracy of the Ys, as well as local churches. The little-known Otis Stanfield, not a very good picture, but that's why he's little-known. Little-known official who he was. I'm saying that there's an interaction between the Americans and the locals in terms of what happened, right? The little-known Otis Stanfield trained the new Indigenous rural secretaries from 1913 to 1919 in Bangalore, and later served the YMCA International Committee for 2 decades after his return from India as a fundraiser. So you shouldn't just stop with these people when they leave the mission field. Also, what do they do when they return home? Okay? This is a story which has been told in considerable detail in a book which will come out by David Hollinger. At the other end of the visibility spectrum was Sherwood, who in the 1930s promoted cooperative farming in the Mississippi Delta. However, it is likely that the influences upon his later venture in rural reconstruction were more complex and multifarious than a purely South Asian origin. But anyway, this map is inadequate for the latter point of these multifarious origins. The feedback effects were not simply from any one country to the United States, but multilateral. Not only did Western Y representatives return home, Indigenous Y leaders in India developed strong contacts with other Western countries. K.T. Paul travelled to Britain in 1819 and 1931, visited the United States twice, and was a leading figure in the World's Conference of YMCAs in Finland in 1926, and the International Missionary Conference in Jerusalem in 1928. Swamidass went to Australia in 1918 and 1926-27 to raise funds for this Indian work and spread news of the work and develop lifelong contacts on funding. Certainly the United States was a major recipient of feedback from the missionary fields, but it was not alone. Even when Swamidass travelled to North America in 1922-23 to proselytise the cooperative credit system, he attended an international forum at Teachers College, New York, gathering experts on the diffusion of agricultural education and technology across the world. He spoke not only on rural India, but also, quote, explained the rural life situation in other Asiatic contexts. There he met Kenyon Butterfield, the American agricultural representative who had already undertaken the survey of agricultural and missionary conditions in China in 1921. Butterfield became a leading promoter of institutionalised American help for rural reconstruction and agricultural college support globally in the 1920s. The impact of the missionary movement upon the United States was multifaceted as well as multilateral. It helped to shape the theology of the social gospel and its wider appeal. To Rauschenbusch, the most distinguished but by no means the only social gospel theorist, the missionary's work bolstered his arguments for the realisation of his concept of the kingdom of God through social action. By 1912, he contended that the social and political structure of the world must be changed. And I quote, "Today, the leaders of the missionary movement are teaching a statesman-like concept of the destiny of Christianity as the spiritual leaven of the East and the common basis of a worldwide Christian civilization." 2 years later, that must have seemed a pretty optimistic view. Nevertheless, we must remember also that Rauschenbusch's sister was a missionary in India for many years, not widely known. The tracks that people took and the travelling of ideas is very complicated. Behind the already diverse theology of the social gospel in the United States, the experience in Asia, particularly in India, as shown in this paper, but most likely in China, influenced international missionary programs. The global institutions of Christian missions were changed in the process, contributing to the toolbox of ideas from which post-World War II developmentalism drew. The Protestant mission boards at home established or encouraged new international institutions after World War I. The International Association of Agricultural Missions was organised in 1919 as a result of the initiative of Benjamin Honeycutt. The Association of Agricultural Missions, quote, represented both foreign and home mission boards of North America, unquote, and spread the knowledge of contributions from many recognised authorities on world work. So it became a clearinghouse for these ideas. Conferences under its auspices in the 1920s publicised the subject, bringing it to the attention of many churches in the United States and elsewhere in the Anglo world. The cross-missionary fertilisation produced a shift in strategy for Protestant missionary leaders in the United States and other Western countries, as shown in the 1928 International Missionary Council. Christian internationalist John Mott had toured the world's key instigator of that conference and its theme. Thereby he pressed ideas originally generated at the local level in Asia, turning what was essentially an Indian revitalisation movement into a global program. From 1915 to 1918, Mott was General Secretary of the International Committee of the Y, and also he was chair of the International Missionary Council, etc. Used his key position at the apex of transnational organisations, feeding information on missionary endeavours to and fro, making peasant uplift central to a revised global missionary plan. This was a transformed version of his The Evangelisation of the World in This Generation. Instead of the emphasis on the outward thrust of Western knowledge and the primacy of evangelical conversion, the new program envisaged an interlocking network of organisations responding to and facilitating rural and industrial change in the developing world. This revision was articulated in his The Present-Day Summons to the World Mission of Christianity, 1931, based on the principles of the 1928 meeting. Mott recommended that on every considerable rural field, special Christian rural institutions or rural departments of general Christian colleges or universities should be developed, together with adequate facilities for experimental work. The YMCA missionary official and international traveller, Professor Basil Matthews of Boston University, noted in 1938 comparative study that the rural reconstruction movement was worldwide, not tied to a specific mission field. But, quote, the model plan was conceived in India by K.T. Paul and developed out of worldwide experience. And that's basically what I'm saying. So it was already said for you in the 1938 book. In the 1930s, this plan was adopted and adapted in China, Japan, and Africa. It treated groups of villages as a unit community to be served by a trained pastor teacher, agriculturalist, and his wife in a holistic program. Mott and Matthews' work was part of a new Christian internationalism that sought distance from the formal imperialism that had overshadowed internationalism before World War I, as shown by Michael Thompson. In 1931, Mott proclaimed this new internationalism through, quote, the world mission of Christianity, led by, quote, tens of thousands of missionaries as ambassadors, interpreters, and mediators. This Christian internationalism, as he called it, was, quote, doing more than any other factor to throw out strands of understanding, friendship, and unselfish collaboration between the peoples of Africa, Asia, Latin America on the one hand, and those of Europe, North America, and Australasia on the other, unquote. In his view, the missionary enterprise had built pathways to multilateral cooperation. Mott's proposals drew authority from the 1928 meeting where the social content of the Christian message, that is the social gospel, addressed the economic problems of the era, thus rendering for the first time, internationally, thus rendering the social gospel internationalist. Paul and other non-European delegates had been vocal at that conference. As Christian internationalism as a social practice was, Mott noted, powerfully seconded or supported by such auxiliary agencies of the churches as the World Student Christian Federation, and he could have added the YMCA, but he didn't have to. He was sure, to be sure, this Christian internationalism has to be assessed in terms of its efficacy, its implementation in the 1930s, a very dark time, and the context of competing internationalisms. That goes beyond my address. I'm not here to praise Christian internationalism, but to explain its genealogy. My point has been to show the colonial origins of this internationalism and the vectors that facilitated its growth. Even though I have another paragraph, I'm happy to stop at that point, if you would like. Do you want me to stop there? It's a nice point to stop, but
Still have 5 minutes.
you give me I've only gone for 55 because we didn't start the time. Okay. Interwar international, this is really just summarised. In conclusion, as the papers say, in conclusion, so at least you know it's coming to an end. Interwar internationalism had origins in the era of high imperialism of the late 19th century through the reaction to the missionary experience of colonialism and nationalism. It took sustenance from and was facilitated by the spread of new globalising technologies of transport and communications. But only in the 1920s could it be largely freed from the assumptions of overt imperialism. This change did not occur automatically. The engagement with the indigenous came to make a difference here. One aspect of this liberation of internationalism from imperialism was the social gospel and its tradition of embedding the Christian mission in a social practice, but shaped in profound ways by exposure to the colonial world and the ability of the YMCA to act as interlocutors to forge a more internationalist version in that practice. So in the ways outlined, we must be careful not to overdo the metropole-colony or colonist versus subaltern dichotomy. What the YMCA case shows is an important level between metropole and colony where indigenous and American influences mixed, and where local results were disseminated, not only in the United States, but globally. So this is not merely a conversation we need to have about Asia, but about the globalization of these ideas as well. We know that this internationalism, this is just a caveat, could not exist in a vacuum, any more than that of high imperialism. Mott knew this. The power politics of the 30s and 40s and the rise of a world divided by the Cold War would influence the shape of Western interventions that had their beginning much earlier. As it turned out, the modernization theme of the US Point 4 programs with high political freight was a surviving intellectual descendant of a much more diverse experience of these social gospels innovations. Thank you very much.